let's start off with the impetus behind the Peaceful Streets Project. You were brutalized by cops and then later founded the Peaceful Streets Project. I'd like to hear about that, but I'd also like to hear about what your thinking was about cops before that incident.
Yeah, so I wouldn't say I was brutalized. I was very fortunate in a lot of ways. I was just driving a buddy home on New Year's Day, and we stopped at a gas station to get some fuel because we were running out. And we happened to see a DWI stop in progress, and we were just observing what was happening, like people sort of always do when they just see cops. And then at some point, one of the police officers went over, grabbed the female passenger, and ripped her out of the car. And at that moment, I just started asking them why they were assaulting her, and took out my phone and tried to take pictures. And then that ended up leading to one of the cops coming after me, shoving me around, ultimately arresting me. And then I found out that I was being charged with a felony of spitting in a cop's face. That incident was my first really bad incident with police officers ever. Um, I had a lot of people who knew me for various political activist type reasons, and they really rallied around me. And through that process, over a couple months, I just ended up having, because we got media attention for it, I just had a bunch of people just stepping forward and telling me their own personal stories of abuse, none of which wanted to sue the police. Like, they weren't looking to sue to get money. None of them wanted to even get retribution on the police. They just wanted to tell me their story and let me know that this happened to them and that it happens to a lot of people, and just give me moral support. And through that process, I just came to much better understand the gravity of the situation of the police, in our nation, but even more broadly in the world. And then I wanted to use what I thought was a relatively unique platform, given my education, background, my work history, and the people who are rallying around me, who typically aren't the people who would rally around, typical victims of police brutality. And so then we went ahead and launched the Peaceful Streets Project as a means to try to combat police abuse.
And
And
what is your background that wouldn't necessarily give itself to rallying around someone like that?
well, one is I'm not black or brown, right? And two is I didn't have any sort of police record. I never even, nothing more than a traffic stop. Um, I graduated from West Point, the United States Military Academy. I also graduated from Stanford with a business degree, and I served in the U.S. military. I was an airborne ranger, qualified engineer officer, and I don't know why that keeps dinging. I don't know about that, so I apologize. Um, but those were just sort of things that people were willing to rally around me for, that they don't that you know that other people didn't have. They couldn't do what they so often do, which is slander my background. They couldn't say that I had smoked marijuana, I've been arrested for this. I was just an unemployed person who didn't have anything better to do. I wasn't going anywhere in my life. All the things that they do to typical victims of police brutality.
So the as I understand it, the Peaceful Streets Project is, and you said this, that the people that came up to you weren't seeking like retribution or anything or money from the city. As I understand it, the Peaceful Streets Project isn't about seeking help or appealing to the power of established politicians or officials. Talk about the approach, and in particular, the police complaint department that you have, and how that can serve to provide actual police accountability.
I definitely don't want to take too much credit for the Peaceful Streets Project holding the police accountable, because we have not held the police accountable. I don't think anyone's figured that piece out. But when we launched, we just knew that there were a lot of organizations that were out there trying to engage with the system and try to nudge the system to be a little bit less oppressive, or a little bit to inject a little humanity into it. And I think that there's a lot of efforts that people are doing that are really great, such as trying to get rid of bail, trying to get rid of mandatory minimums, drug laws, trying to stop community policing in black and brown and poor communities. What we didn't see was many people who were actually in the street trying to engage in ways that could actually make it more painful for the police officers to commit these acts against people. So, and we had a lot of great mentors. We referenced a lot of longtime activists here in Austin and more broadly to ask, how can we actually leverage this sort of small movement right now in a positive way? And so direct action really was what we wanted to focus on. And the biggest form of direct action for us that's been helpful has been cop watching. But the Police Abuse Complaint Department was a way for us to allow people to have a voice and just put it up on the internet so that they could tell their story, because typically the only story that's ever told is through the media, through mugshots and a recap of whatever the police officer wrote in the arresting affidavit, which is usually filled with lies. And so we just wanted to humanize the so many people who have had these bad experiences with police officers, and also let people know that this isn't just something that only happens to people who are committing crimes, although it shouldn't even happen to people who are committing crimes, but it happens to people just by virtue of their existence, whether they're an immigrant or whether they're black or brown or whether they live in a poor community or just the wrong place at the wrong time. And so we wanted people to understand that in a way of just moving society a little bit more towards more compassionate way of dealing with our social ills as opposed to relying on the violence of the state.
And another thing that you guys do, and you mentioned it, like the know your rights, like teaching people to know what they have the right to do and what cops have the rights or not the rights to do. What is your perspective on self-defense? Because there's this gray area between compliance with police, as organizations like the ACLU say, but also the right for one to defend oneself against oppression, and this sort of perspective, set forth by groups like the Black Panthers, many decades ago, was this idea of trying to defend your own community. Does the Peaceful Streets Project have a perspective on self-defense in that way?
Right. That's a good question. And a lot of people don't like the name Peaceful Streets because they assume that means that we're pacifists and that we believe that people should just take whatever the police give them. I'm a strong advocate of self-defense. I recognize at the same time that if you engage in self-defense and you don't have a really strong community that's going to be there with you, that it tends to work out really, really badly. And so if I'm being assaulted by a police officer, I'm most likely going to take it and hope that I survive and fight another day, because if I fight back, then they shoot me. But as far as community self-defense, people coming together for one another, I think that's immensely important. I think that we need to get rid of the notion that that the system's going to work for us, particularly the people who are most marginalized and oppressed, because it's never going to work for them. The system's set up in order to crush them, and it's I mean, I don't want to use this word. It might be a heavy word, but I think it's stupidity to some degree to believe that that the oppressor is going to have mercy on you when we have a long history where that's exactly what they're not going to have. So I'm a big fan of self-defense. I just think that communities that decide to go that path, they need to be really committed to it, and it can't just be something that they put on a website. And it has to be something that they're really willing to rally around. I rarely see videos of people freeing other people from the police.
Yeah.
And I would love to see a lot more of that.
And how does because obviously in the past, decade and a half, we've seen this tremendous militarization of the police. How does that fit into that discussion? But also, how does that fit into the work that you do?
Uh, well, the militarization of the police, I think, is problematic. But I don't necessarily. I think that it's in some ways made out to be a bigger driver of the problem than it really is. I mean, the police have been the police long before they had tanks and LRADs and whatnot. Um, they've always been an occupying force in certain communities, um, but but in order to effectively organize against them and to engage in self-defense, we are obviously entering into an era where there has to be a lot more thought put into what self-defense means, and there has to be more thought into how we secure people, how we secure their so-called freedoms, how we set up support groups to help them get through an initial incident, and what likely would come afterwards, which is an aggressive occupation or manhunt. If someone did decide to go down that path. I think that I went a little off tangent on your question.
No, no, it's fine. But I am curious about this, the issue of self-defense. Like, we spoke to former Black Panther Kilu Nyasha on the show, and she said that, I obviously don't think that we can do what we did in the past, which is, when Black Panthers followed the cops carrying shotguns. Because these days, if you go up against an MRAP with a shotgun, that's not going to do you much good. Like, with this intense militarization of the cops, like, what could community self-defense really look like?
Yeah. So I think that to some degree there's power in numbers, and there's just this notion of cops are just less likely to do something when they're outnumbered, and so it's hard to go against a military unit, which is effectively what police are, in so many parts of the country. Um, and so taking them head on isn't going to work. But if you look at the history of warfare, guerrilla warfare is extremely effective. And I'm not suggesting right here that people go out and start shooting cops, but there's different ways that people can organize to resist and to undermine the institution of policing and to build up, the community institutions that they have that can support one another. So I think yes, you're going to be, from a perspective of firepower, you're always going to be outnumbered until there's a critical mass in the society that recognizes what the police are and they start to do something about it. But I think that communities right now can engage in ways that at least mitigates what the police can do in a certain community, and ideally can actually start to expel police from their communities. And it doesn't have to be violence, and I'm not in any way saying that violence is not the solution. But there's little things that people can do, such as refusing to interact with police officers, letting police officers know that they're not welcome in their community, refusing to serve them when they come into like local businesses. And every single time something like that happens, it makes the news because it's usually a worker and not the owner who's making that decision. And unfortunately, the owner usually comes right in and says, "Oh, I'm so sorry. I'm going to donate $5,000 to a fraternal order, and we welcome the police here whenever." But if you actually had local community leaders saying, "No, I support my workers," and we don't want the police around, and if that was made very clear, all this talk about community policing and working with the police, I think that would dissipate, and people would start to recognize who the police are and what they really do, and it would make the cops uncomfortable enough so they just didn't want to come around.
So, in that same vein of cops being removed from communities entirely, we previously had on the show the retired police captain Ray Lewis, who said at one point he was a brutal cop and that the force did nothing to offer legitimate psychological training or help once he was actually a cop. Luckily, he had the strength to better himself on his own and ultimately went on to retire and joined in Occupy and BLM down in Ferguson and anti-police brutality movements. But the question is, like, do you think, like, if reforms were made, if cops were only taken in who had a certain level of empathy, as opposed to now when they don't take cops who score a certain level or higher on an empath test, do you think that would help, or is the idea that there are no good cops, we need to abolish the institution of policing?
Yeah. So I'll go back to a question you asked me at the beginning, which I didn't really answer. At the beginning of all this, I knew that the police had problems. I knew that there were so-called bad cops out there, but I wasn't fundamentally against the institution of policing. And the one incident of police abuse or brutality that stood out to me was um, oh my God, I can't believe Oscar Grant, Oscar Grant in Oakland, and that happened just 3 years to the day before my incident. And but I saw that as a one-time or a singular event that doesn't represent all police. And at the very beginning, I was very adamant about saying not all cops are bad. We support the good cops. We just want the good cops to stand up to the bad cops. We want these bad cops held accountable. And and I did everything that I could to appeal to these so-called good cops to step forward. But over not a very long amount of time, probably only 6 months, I started to recognize that these so-called good cops, we can't find them anywhere, right? And we can get videos of them handing toys out to kids or playing basketball with kids, but we just couldn't find any examples of cops really going against the really violent, the most criminal police officers. And there's so many opportunities for them to do so. And the fact that out of a million cops in America, none can step up and do it, and the only ones who really say anything are former cops. Kind of like Ray Lewis, Serpico, in his day. It's always when they're on their way out or after the fact that they sort of step up and they'll start to talk about the institution of policing. And so through that process, I've come to the belief, and it's more fundamental to like what my philosophy on life is, and how I want to utilize my time on Earth. That there's institutions and there's social hierarchies that can take really good people who have what you think are strong ethical values, and once you put them in a situation and you give them power, and an institution encourages a certain use of that power, it doesn't matter how good you are, you're going to become bad. And that's the situation with police. So all cops are bastards, not because all cops go into policing with the intention of being a bastard, but at the end of the day, they become bastards. And so, yeah, I fundamentally believe there's no such thing as a good cop. And if a cop ever tries to do the good thing in the moment, they very quickly find themselves being run out of the profession.
Yeah, it's kind of like the Stanford study that was done in the 60s or 70s where they had prisoners and then guards, and the guards very quickly became incredibly authoritarian and despicable human beings. And so, in terms of police abolition, sort of segueing now into like how we're programmed, I guess. Because if you look at what's happening in northern Syria right now, they don't have like traditional police. They have different military that fights ISIS, of course, and the U.S. in other ways. But they have like basically community structures where they have peacekeepers, that one male, one female, that like are peacekeepers for their block, and that's like a rotating, everything's sort of like a rotating post, so that no one ever has this stagnant state of power. Talk about like how we're programmed to think that cops are necessary, and what some alternatives are that either you're working on or that you've heard about and seen that you'd like to see as opposed to the institution of police.
And I think that you put it really well, that we're programmed to believe that we need it. And that's just a function of being in society. We're programmed to believe a lot of things. Like we need schools, we need leaders, we need politicians, we need police. We need certain services that the government provides. We need corporations to handle certain aspects of the market, because that's what we're raised with. And even if our parents tend to be more in tune and enlightened with the problems of hierarchy and power, it's really hard to avoid it when you live in a society where you consume media, where you're sent to school, where you get a job, etc. And so, I think that in a lot of ways we have to constantly push back against that. But it's not sufficient just to say that we don't need police, right? Because the first response you get when you tell people that, yeah, I want to abolish the police, I want to abolish prisons, I want to abolish jail. The first question, that always comes out of people's mouths is, well, what are you going to do with the criminals? What are you going to do with the murderers? I say, well, stop giving them badges and guns to begin with. But but people have to create alternatives, because just saying that you want to abolish something isn't very compelling, and quite frankly, it doesn't rally a lot of people to the cause. But I saw the piece that you did with Scott Crow, and he talked about building power, creating capacity, creating alternatives, and that's what I think that's exactly what people have to do. And when it comes to what can we do instead of policing, I think that example that you have from Syria is beautiful, because that's the people saying this is something that matters to us. This is a problem that we want to deal with, but we also recognize that if we sort of give anyone a badge and say you're now the crime fighter or you're the person who's going to deal with these problems, they're going to abuse it. So that rotational aspect I think is beautiful. But we as communities, we have to deal with, what really underlies, what crime is. And I'm talking about real crime. I'm not talking about the government trying to, get people for sleeping in a public park or feeding the homeless or smoking weed. I'm talking about rape and murder, real crimes. But what underlies that is a lot of social ills and a lot of disparities. And so, if we as communities we can come together and we can address mental illness and we can support one another, and everyone, not just the people who are, labeled as mentally ill, but everyone needs mental health services. If we can focus on providing everybody with the basic necessities so that they can feel like they're a part of society, a human society, and that they can contribute to their community, even if it's not, in the ways that we typically look at work. That takes away a lot of, the that the ingredients for crime. And then most crime happens to be between people who know each other, right? The violent crime. And so if we can have sort of conflict resolution and we can identify problems before they become problems, and we can work with relationships that are abusive, so that instead of bringing it to a head, we actually get them to work through it and, if necessary, move on in a peaceful way. I think that is essential and critical to being able to effectively move forward, with a police abolition sort of mindset. But I do think it's problematic that there's a lot of people out there that say abolish police, abolish prisons, but they don't want to talk about the alternatives, and they really don't want to create alternatives. And I think that's what's, most important. And I'm not doing it myself, at least on the policing side. And that's something that I would love to see Peaceful Streets end up doing more proactively. As far as seeing groups that have actually gone down this path, um, I haven't studied it much, so I don't know. I do know that there's some sort of private security initiatives that have been out there, but I gotta tell you, I don't like private security. I think that private security brings its own problems. Whoever's paying for the service has the power. The homeless or the houseless, people of color, those communities are still going to be attacked. If there's a private security firm that's dealing with this stuff. You might be able to hold them a little bit more accountable than the police, but they're still going to be abusive. So I'm not a big fan of private security as the answer to how we abolish police.
Yeah, anything that sort of has the name security or private, it just has that sort of ring that, like, oh, you've just been given authority from a different entity rather than the state. That doesn't mean that, like what we saw in North Dakota, like the fact that there was private security there didn't really help the water protectors any. So sort of carrying on with that tangent, or that same line of questioning. You saying that, like, we're programmed in a lot of ways, not just to believe that we need police, but that corporations are good, and that the president is something that we need, as is the federal government, et cetera, et cetera. Something that you also do is combat the traditional schooling paradigm. And I think that, something that all of us who had traditional schooling spend a lot of time as adults trying to break down and understand why we think about certain things a certain way. So talk about this idea of reschooling or breaking down the traditional schooling paradigm and what that looks like in terms of of making it happen right now, building that alternative at the moment.
And this is the one area where I feel like people really can take power immediately, because as many problems as we have in America, the one thing that we really have a lot of liberty on, relative to everything else, is how we raise our children and education. And so no one's forced to go to. I mean, some people are forced to go to school, but very few people are actually forced to go to school. It's a conscious decision that people can make. Most people don't believe that they have that decision, and so they just go ahead and enroll their kids in public school. But it's actually a decision that they can make. And I'm a big advocate of self-directed, non-coercive educational environments, and that doesn't have to be a school. It can be a home, it can be a community center, it can be young people just being in the world with adults. Unfortunately, we live in a society that is extremely hierarchical, and it's very, very evident when we talk about children, because a child who's caught without their parents before the age of 16 or before the age of 18 during certain hours of the day and certain days of the week are automatically assumed to be truant or delinquents, and that they can't contribute to society, or to general society. Um, so what I do is I try to encourage people in every way that they can to step away from that. And it's not about curriculum. It's not about what they're taught. It's not about getting them into college. It's just tearing down the belief that young people need to go to adults, people with certain titles, people with the answers, in order to get guidance so that they can proceed through life, so that they can get into the right college and get into the right job, and so that they can be what people call a productive member of society. And instead, allow young people to question everything from the beginning, in a community of uh, peers and non-peers, preferably mixed age, preferably people as young as 0 and as old as 100, in all different aspects of life, and be able to learn through just experience society, sort of like we used to before we had formal schools. And the schools are so effective, and before schools it was really religion, but the schools are so effective at convincing children that they're incompetent, that they're lazy, that they're no good, unless they do exactly what the parents say or the adults say, and that they have to constantly appeal to authority and win over authority so that someday they can become the authority. And if we can break that down and we can get people to recognize that every single human being has a tremendous amount to contribute to the human condition, um, and that we can do so in cooperative ways as opposed to competitive ways, where instead of I'm shooting to be valedictorian so I can get into Harvard or Stanford, I'm shooting to be as valuable as I can be to the people I care about in my community. Then we can create 74 million new people who go out into the world, and actually push back against the hierarchies and the institutions that we have right now.
How do you see that manifesting in terms of, because the state always finds a way to fight back at this. How do you see this manifesting in conjunction with the movement to abolish police and sort of this idea of building alternatives in sort of an ungovernable community space?
So I think that this is a lot easier than going against the police, because everyone believes not everyone, but a very large portion of the population believes that policing is necessary. It's the rare person who believes that policing is absolutely unnecessary. We need to abolish it. Um, people are far more critical of how schools work, and they can see, and it's very evident that it doesn't work really well. And with policing, if there's, if there's what they call social deviance, they say, well, we just need more cops, we need more harsh sentences, etc. And that's something that people can really latch onto. People who are scared can really latch onto that. With school, they've tried that. They say, well, we need more school, and we need to be more we need to push more discipline and be more zero tolerance. But a lot less people are buying into that. And so there, the history of sort of homeschooling, it exists in the 60s and 70s. It was mostly radical leftists, anti-establishment folks. But in the early 80s, it really caught on with the religious right, and it just exploded in the 80s. And the government had their opportunity to really come in and put the clamp down and say, no, schooling is compulsory. You have to go to a state-approved school. But they missed the boat on that. And the religious right became such a powerful lobby that now most politicians won't even touch that. And I really feel that that is sort of a wedge. That's sort of like a foothold that we have that we can exploit. Where, and this is the interesting thing about it, self-directed learning environments. When we take out the hierarchy and the authority and the discipline out of a learning situation, it tends to create young people who are actually healthier, happier, more well-adjusted, better in terms of mental health, and they actually have better academic outcomes. And so if we can just go ahead and pull more people out of coercive schools, and I include private schools in this because private schools that have hierarchy are just as bad. And allow them to lead self-directed learning experiences. We're already sort of at the point where people know that it's an option, and then when they see these really positive outcomes from it, then that's a situation where I don't think the government can stop it, and the government can't just round up every single child and put them in school if we as a society recognize that this is really harmful to children in ways that they can do so to Muslims or etc. Other targeted groups that they have.
So great. I mean, just wrapping up here, is there anything that you'd like to add that I didn't directly touch upon?
At the end of the day, my work in sort of the police realm and in the education realm, it really comes down to the same issue for me. The problems, the greatest. There's always going to be problems, and we're never going to have utopia. Even if like you and I got to design it, right? We'd still screw it up, and there'd still be harm. But at the end of the day, hierarchy and power is ultimately what's most problematic, because one bad person who wants to murder is going to be able to kill some people. But when you have an institution that somehow conveys a sense of moral authority and power over people, then they can use that to kill millions, and much lesser crimes that in scale are pretty horrific as well. And I think this can address the issues with war. This can address the issues with certain, like the fascism that's really bubbling up in our society, ecological issues, etc. For me, it almost always comes down to hierarchy and power. And so to the extent that we can dismantle that, we can go ahead and create a better world for the future.
And to learn more about the Peaceful Streets Project and Antonio's work, visit peacefulstreets.com.